Let's discuss the very latest. Peter Baker is back with us, and joining the conversation, we have Washington Post columnist and senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, Max Boot, and MS Now senior national security reporter, David Rohde. David, it's just a big waiting game right now. What's the latest on this memo? Are we hearing anything, any kind of response from Iran?
There's no clear response from Iran. Pakistani officials are pushing and trying to get the two sides to come together to agree on that. So we're just waiting to see what Iran says. I'm concerned that we're getting into this pattern of President Trump saying the Iranians are, and they want to make a deal. We've devastated their forces, and then threatening bombing. And that's sort of losing its power because he doesn't end up, carrying out the bombing. And then there's some great new reporting by NBC News about this naval mission that the U.S. launched a couple days ago. It seemed a move by the United States to reopen the Strait of Hormuz by force, to have U.S. Navy ships and then aircraft go in, and it worked for about 24 hours. But the NBC News reporting, which MS Now has not been able to corroborate yet, citing multiple sources, though, said that the Trump administration, specifically apparently President Trump, did not tell any of our allies in the Gulf about this operation. Saudi Arabia, the UAE did not know about it, the Omanis, until after he publicly announced it. And the reason they say, the story says, is that the Saudi government was so upset that they blocked access to one of their air bases. Again, we haven't confirmed this yet, but that would be a major error just in terms of basic diplomacy to launch such an important operation without letting your allies know.
I do want to pick up on that with Max in just a moment. But first, Peter, the tension right now is understandably palpable around the world. If a deal doesn't shake out, President Trump is threatening to start bombing again at a, quote, even more intense level. But is there really any appetite inside the White House to resume this war?
Well, this one-page term sheet looks like an effort to try to say the war is over and push off the actual complicated details down the road, right? One page is not going to resolve the issues the United States has with Iran. It's not going to resolve what to do about its nuclear program. It's not going to resolve what to do about the Strait of Hormuz. What it's basically saying is, let's agree to stop fighting, and then we can talk about these things. And then, of course, it becomes really complicated because that's where the rubber meets the road. So it seems to me, like on the surface that this is an effort by the president to say, let's move past the kinetic part of this phase and move on, which suggests he doesn't want to resume hostilities at this point. Given the political pressures at home, given the poll numbers, given the upcoming midterms, that may not be surprising. But Iran knows that too. They're watching these same polls that we're seeing, and they understand that they can wait him out, or at least they think that they can wait him out. And therefore, they may go along with this, some version of this term sheet in order to try to enter into a new phase, but they don't feel the same pressure right now that they did even just a few weeks ago.
Max, David outlined this NBC News reporting about Saudi Arabia's role in all of this. President Trump had wanted cooperation from Gulf states to implement the Project Freedom operation in the Strait of Hormuz, but Saudi Arabia apparently wasn't on board, and after being kept out of the loop with other Gulf nations, revoked America's access to its airspace and air bases. NBC reporting that a call between the Saudi Crown Prince and President Trump did not solve the issue, and ultimately we saw President Trump hit pause on Project Freedom. What do you make of that dynamic?
Well, I think the larger dynamic is that President Trump has blundered into this quagmire and doesn't know how to get out of it. And he keeps trying one gimmick after another. Initially, he was under the misapprehension that killing the supreme leader would force Iran to capitulate in short order. Obviously, that did not happen. Then he thought that several weeks of bombing targeting Iranian military sites would force Iran to capitulate. That did not happen. Instead, Iran closed down the Strait of Hormuz, took a chokehold over 20% of the world's oil. And now President Trump is basically struggling to get out of this war in some face-saving way to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and to hopefully get some limitations on Iran's nuclear program. But what's striking to me, based on the list that David is reporting, and that's been reported elsewhere in terms of what the administration is asking for, so many of President Trump's initial demands have fallen off the list. There's nothing in there about eliminating Iran's ballistic missile program. There's nothing in there about eliminating Iranian support for proxies around the region. And of course, there's nothing in there about regime change. Remember, at the start of this war, President Trump was saying he was going to determine who was going to rule Iran. He was calling for unconditional surrender. How far we have come from that, because in essence, Iran has more than held its own. And now Trump simply wants to get out of this conflict and has kind of given up on most of his initial objectives.
Meantime, the situation in Lebanon seems to be heating up. Peter, Israel struck the suburbs of Beirut yesterday, the first time since the ceasefire between these two countries went into effect. What is Israel's calculation in testing that truce? Does this not also risk the fragile ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran as well?
Well, it does. Iran has said that Lebanon has to be part of any kind of resolution of this war. Of course, Hezbollah, supported for many years by Iran. Israel has gone along with President Trump's, insistence that it hold off reluctantly, and that strike obviously suggests just how reluctant. It suggests that they are, in fact, still going to find moments when they feel compelled to take action for its own security, regardless of what Trump wants to do. But, what Trump is going to say is this doesn't really count. We've had missiles flying in the last few days. They're saying that's not really a violation of the ceasefire. We've had American forces take out some of these small Iranian boats. They're saying that doesn't really count as a violation of the ceasefire. They're so anxious at this point to be able to move on from the war that they're willing to overlook things that would seem to be challenging to the idea that we are in a ceasefire at the moment.
And on the ground in Iran, the human rights activist news agency reports that 28 people have been executed in the past 7 weeks. David, what more do we know about this?
They have continued. Those numbers are new, and this is an accelerating pace of executions. And again, one of the messages from the White House is that the Iranian regime is divided and they can't get a straight answer. I asked 2 congressional officials who have knowledge of the current sort of assessment of the Iranian government, and they said they haven't heard that it's divided. It has become a more hardline regime after the leadership was wiped out on the first day of this war. And the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, the military wing, has tremendous power right now. One of these sources called it a military dictatorship. And they're carrying out these executions. And, you have to look at the reality of what's happening there. And I don't think that they're divided. I think they're determined to outweigh Trump. If Iran can get this one-page deal, and there's sort of a pause in the American blockade, and maybe the opening of the strait as well, that is a win for Iran. President Trump was like, we're going to start this blockade. They're going to have to, give in to our demands. And if it's just this one-page agreement, which is essentially prolonging the ceasefire, I think that's a win for Iran.
Max, you mentioned how regime change hadn't happened, although that's counter to the narrative that the president has put out there, that he says this has been regime change. And he has signaled, or at least at times suggested, that the new leadership in Iran are people that he can work with, and that, again, that negotiations are sort of proceeding here. But when you hear 28 people have been executed in the last 7 weeks, what does that say about this new regime in Iran?
It suggests this is not a kinder, gentler Iranian regime. I mean, remember, in some ways, the march to war began in January when the Iranian regime was killing tens of thousands of its own citizens in a successful attempt to repress protests. And President Trump was tweeting about help is on the way. We're going to help the Iranian patriots, and so on and so forth. And now it's pretty obvious we are not providing any actual help to the Iranian patriots. Now we're in a situation where President Trump is dealing with this new, very hardline Iranian regime, which is essentially run by IRGC generals more than anybody else. And they are feeling like they're in a pretty strong position right now because, again, they control 20% of the world's oil by closing down the Strait of Hormuz. We saw earlier this week President Trump's abortive attempt to try to reopen the strait, Project Freedom, which lasted about a day, clearly a non-starter for all concerned. And so, unfortunately, I think there is a sense of impunity in Tehran where they're going to feel like they're emerging stronger from this conflict. And there's certainly no relaxation, no liberalization in Iran, either in the way they deal with their own people or the way they deal with the region. In fact, they're a greater threat to the region than ever because of their ability to target Persian Gulf energy infrastructure.